The latest efforts to reduce the carbon footprint are coming from the European Union. There's something called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM for short. Our Moon Hye-ryeon has the details on just what it is and how South Korea is planning to respond to this new policy.
The transitional period before the full implementation of CBAM for countries exporting goods to the EU, including South Korea, began this month. CBAM is a measure aimed at preventing what's called carbon leakage, when a company moves its production facilities from a country with strict carbon emission policies to one with more lax policies. With CBAM, production facilities based outside of the EU will have to pay the same amount for their carbon emissions as sites within the bloc using the original emissions trading system. From the beginning of this month up until the end of 2025, only greenhouse gas emissions need to be reported without needing to make any financial payments. But from 2026, importers will need to declare the quantity of goods being brought into the EU in the preceding year, as well as what's called their embedded greenhouse gas emissions, which are greenhouse gas emissions generated during the production and transportation of goods. They will then have to surrender the relevant number of CBAM certificates priced at the weekly average auction price of EU ETS allowances. The South Korean government estimates that roughly 140 domestic companies will be affected as producers of what the EU defines carbon-intensive goods: cement, iron, steel and aluminium, fertilizers, electricity and hydrogen. Steel and aluminium exports are predicted to drop by more than 1/5 because a survey showed that more than half of South Korean companies who exported goods to the EU and plan to do so in the future do not have any plans in place for CBAM. An industry insider said that the reason behind this is because SMEs don't have the capacity to prepare for new situations like this, and the EU has not yet released detailed guidelines.
Another reason is that there are a lot of companies that lack knowledge or capacity for an organized MRV system.
MRV stands for Measure, Report, Verify, and is a basic tool to report carbon emissions. The government plans to provide funding to SMEs so they can implement it and expand consulting for employees about MRV. In addition to forming a dedicated task force, local companies can use the current domestic emission calculation system to report to the EU until the end of 2025. In an emergency economic meeting earlier this week, Finance Minister Chu Kyung-ho outlined some solutions going forward.
We will consult with the EU to recognise domestic emissions costs. In addition, we will actively support technology development and facility investment to reduce carbon emissions for export items to the EU, such as hydrogen-reduced steel.
The government also plans to open further negotiations with the Taxation and Customs Union of the EU next month. Moon Hye-ryeon, Arirang News.